Today, the Labor Party released the costings of its pre-election spending and claims it will find savings by cutting $6.4 billion from the cost of consultants and contractors in the next 4 years, plus a further $760 million by increasing student visa charges to $20,000. But look, since the beginning of this year, both sides of politics have pledged more than $30 billion in extra spending in their quest to win over voters, from bulk billing and Medicare to new roads in key electrics and on-call 24/7 health advice, plus Labor's $5 a week tax cuts and the coalition's cut the petrol excise and allowing first home buyers tax deductions on their mortgages. Well, the billions seem never ending. Well, today, though, came a wake-up call from ratings agency S&P Global. It says Australia's coveted AAA rating could come under pressure because of this spending. And it prompted these responses from either side of politics.
Now, if the ratings agencies are worried about spending and if they're worried about off-budget funds, we've demonstrated, we've found the room for our election commitments. The budget is stronger at the end of the campaign than it was at the beginning. But Peter Dutton is a big red flashing light when it comes to household budgets, when it comes to the national budget, and when it comes to the national economy in uncertain times.
I guess the point of the report is that Labor is reckless with taxpayers' money. They always spend, they always tax, and therefore that's why they've got an unrealised capital gains tax. Let's just think about that for a moment. So before you sell your shares or your house or your asset, it's gone up in value and you're going to pay tax on that before you sell it.
The author of that report is Anthony Walker, Director of Sovereign and International Public Finance at S&P Global Ratings, and he joins me now. Anthony, many thanks for your time. I mean, it just seems to me right now that both sides are spending tens of billions of dollars in this election campaign. Tell me, how real is the risk to the AAA credit rating?
Yeah, and that's why we published this report, Ross. What we are seeing is a lot of spending across both parties and minor parties as well, and we're really curious as to how it's going to be funded, and that's the real issue for us. Deficits of 2 to 2.5% of GDP are consistent with the AAA, but are they going to be there, or are they going to be more like 3 or 4% post-GFC levels? We don't know the answer to that yet.
So why do you not know the answer? You can see the spending that is potentially coming depending on how the parliament is formed after the election. Why is it you can't get a sense as to whether these deficits are bigger or less? Because you already know what the spending commitments are.
Yeah, it's really on the revenue side and how they're going to fund it. So we have seen some kind of indications by the coalition that they were going to cut 40,000 FTE to try and fund it. We don't know where they're sitting these days. No party seems interested in raising taxes. We are seeing tax cuts in the next 12 to 18 months from both parties. So the answer for us is there going to be additional taxes to cover it? Are they going to find internal savings? Or are they just going to keep debt funding it? And if they continue to debt fund it at 3 to 4% of GDP per year, that's when we start seeing net debt for the country rise rapidly, and that could become inconsistent with the AAA rating.
Well, the one thing we're seeing here is public spending as a percentage of GDP going up over 25%, whereas historically it's been below 20%. This really shows almost a centralisation of Australia's economy, and that's a worrying sign, I would have thought.
Yeah, it is one of the concerns that we have, and it's not just at the federal level. This is going across all the states as well. We did see, as you said, spending was around 20% of GDP for the last 40 years. What we're seeing now is it's around 26 to 27%. We knew it was going to be there during COVID, but most countries have started trying to pull that back to a long-term average. In Australia, there seems no discussion about that. So now we're seeing spending as a proportion of the GDP 5 or 6% higher than historical averages. And we're curious as to where the revenue is going to come to fund that extra 5% of GDP.
So historically, generally what happens is Australia gets lucky. There's a mining boom or there is suddenly very rapid economic growth. We know the long-term average is 3%, but right now it's jogging on barely above 1%, and it had been even lower than that previously. Is that the fundamental problem, that there's a lack of economic growth? And that, of course, comes back to government policy.
Yeah, that's part of the problem. It's spending as well as a pretty average economic growth. If you're running a deficit of 2% and the economy is growing at 2.5%, your actual debt to GDP is actually shrinking over time. What we're seeing, though, is that debt is rising probably around 2.5% to 3% going forward, if not more, depending on what the government does after the election. But economic growth, as you said, is 1 to 2%. So the whole overall debt burden for the society is actually rising. And that's the concern for us.
Does it worry you also, Anthony, that there seems to be no real commitment from either side of politics right now to get the budget back into surplus? That there's really no talk about this in the election campaign, because it seems as though if you do that, somehow you've got to cut, and if you cut, you can't get elected.
Yeah, the AAA doesn't actually need a surplus to maintain the AAA of the government. If we see a small deficit of 1 or 2% of GDP, that's sufficient to keep the AAA rating. The concern that we are seeing is that that may not be the case going forward. We could actually have deficits as high as 4% per annum. We just really need to see how the government's going to fund, or the government of the day, whoever wins the election on that day, is going to fund their election commitments.
Is the real issue here, Anthony, on both sides of politics, a lack of discipline in regards to spending? Because these commitments, the billions of dollars, just seem to have kept rolling out during this election campaign.
Yeah, it has been a change of attitude in the last 3 or 4 years, particularly post-COVID. What we saw is not just the federal government, but all the state governments. It used to be very fiscally conservative on a global scale. That's no longer the case. A lot of governments, the federal government and states, got used to spending money when it was very cheap. And voters got used to getting handouts, and they got used to getting things given to them, whether it was infrastructure or was it cost of living subsidies. The issue at the moment is we know it's popular with the voters, and both parties know that. So we're not seeing across Australia's federal government or state governments any kind of rhetoric around returning back to standard levels of spending, and that's becoming an issue.
And then there's also ongoing commitments that the federal governments will have to go to, which is for defence. Certainly in health, they've committed significant amounts of money, which is baked into the economy into the future. And then you've got the interest bill on the debt, which is going to mount.
Yeah, it's exactly right. So we've got health going up, pensions going up, NDIS funding going up. Now defence, we hit 3% of GDP. That's another couple $2 billion a year. And so what we're looking at is tens of billions of dollars extra spending per annum. And we're curious as to how it's going to be funded. Can it be funded by one-off commodity booms? We don't think that's a sustainable approach going forward. It needs to be funded through recurring expenditure.
And where does that
revenue?
I was going to say, where does that recurring revenue come from, though, in an ideal situation?
Yeah, well, and traditionally it's been coming from taxpayers. So we do know Australia has one of the highest tax burdens when it comes to income tax. No government seems to be really wanting to reform that, and kind of where do you find the tax other than incomes? If you look at Europe, it's usually around value-added taxes. In other words, the GST. We know that the GST pool is not growing as much as it could. It was on every product. So there are other taxation powers out there the government can look at, but there seems to be very little appetite to reform the economy and look at productivity growth.
Very little appetite whatsoever, Anthony, because they know they can't get elected if they go with those policies. Anthony Walker is the Director of Sovereign and International Public Finance at S&P Global Ratings with that warning about the AAA credit rating. And Anthony, many thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Ross.
Now, that's interesting stuff. But look, just before we leave all those Labor Party costings today, and of course we might see the coalitions in the next couple of days, just a little bit of maths I had to work out today for you. The government has today said it's going to raise $760 million over the next 4 years. This is by increasing student visa costs to $2,000. Currently, they're $1,600. So in other words, an extra $400 per visa. But look, if you take $760 million and you divide it by 400, you get 1.9 million visas over the next 4 years. And I couldn't kind of work this out. Anyway, that's 475,000 visas a year. So in other words, it's a hell of a lot of students, because in the last financial year, just 207,000 foreign students arrived in Australia. But both parties are on the record as saying they're going to cut further the number of students coming to Australia. So either we missed something, I thought, or there's something obvious that wasn't in the press release by Labor Party, or my maths was just plain wrong. So we checked with the Treasurer's Office, with Labor HQ, the Finance Minister's Office, and there is a bit of a quirk in this, because yes, while 207,000 students came into Australia last year, 498,000 students actually applied for visas. So in other words, a lot of people didn't come. So far this financial year, there have been 226,000 applications to the end of February, according to the Finance Minister's Office. So in other words, 500,000 applications, give or take, by $4,000, the extra, by 4 years equals close on $800 million. And that's how Labor did the maths. Anyway, another big problem for Australia's economy, as you've heard, is that it's growing well below its long-term trend. Lower growth means it's harder to pay for all of those election pledges, but there are ways the economy can be boosted. The interest rates by cutting them is one, and a falling Australian dollar is another. This week we'll get a sign about how many rate cuts could be on the way when our quarterly inflation rate to the end of March is released on Wednesday. Reuters economist survey says the annual headline rate will drop from 2.4 to 2.3%. That's well inside the Reserve Bank's preferred target band. But the RBA pays more attention, of course, to underlying inflation. Now, the odds of rate cuts during that period of time are also coming off. It's almost a given there'll be a 0.25% rate cut, but not so much of an indication now that that rate cut will be by 0.5%.